Good morning, everyone, ladies, gentlemen, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Kevin Kipchirchir, and it's my pleasure to moderate this webinar on behalf of Cliff Decker of Maya, titled The Modern Employer Building Inclusive Workplaces in Africa. These cannot have come at a better time, as we are seeing employment spaces evolving across Africa over time, with newer generations joining the workforce, even more stronger calls for diversity within the workforce, and a targeted era towards technology and digital evolution. Joining me today for this important conversation are Imelda Sebufu, Senior People Officer at Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, present in over 12 countries, and she will be giving us perspectives from a human resources perspective on some of these important items. I will also be joined by Jean Ewang, who's also a counsel at our Cliff Decker Johannesburg office within the Employment Department. Also joining me is Victoria Agomor, Senior Associate at Udo Udoma Bello Sagie in Nigeria, one of our relationship firms there, giving us perspectives on Nigerian law and Nigerian perspectives on these important topics. And last but certainly not the least is Daniel Kiragwi, joining us from the Nairobi office of Cliff Decker of Maya, who will share perspectives from a legal and also practical perspectives from the on the Kenyan legal side of things. So just for housekeeping, this session is recorded, and a recording will be circulated to all attendees after this session, but please feel free to raise questions in the Q&A function. We'll be taking these questions as we go along, but ideally these will be a discussion between the panelists over the next 1 hour, and a dedicated Q&A session, or plenary really, will be available to all the panelists at the end of that discussion. Also, do note that your microphones and videos are muted, but in case you want to raise a question to the panel, that will be afforded at the end of the Q&A section and supported by our organizers. So today's topic will just explore the practical and legal dimensions of inclusion across Africa, what it means to be an inclusive workforce in Africa. What does it mean for employers, even as they expand across borders? It is now common to see employers operating in more than one country, especially with the implementation of the Africa Free Trade Area agreement, which enables businesses to be in more than one jurisdiction. And what does it mean when you have to consider more aspects of diversity than you would, for instance, in one country? And not to mention that Africa is a rich tapestry of cultures. Within Nigeria alone, and Victoria can correct me, there are over 371 tribes. So when you're thinking about diversity, you're thinking from that magnitude. In South Africa, you have over and above, the ordinary diversity options of white versus black. We have 11 tribes within there. And what does that mean for employers when they're considering about inclusivity, about leadership? The webinar today is framed in 3 topical issues: the modern workforce, and secondly, inclusion in the African context, what it means across our cultures, across our systems, and we'll also examine some of the barriers to true inclusion in the African context. And then lastly, we'll speak about future-proofing the workplace. But enough from the moderator now. Let's hear from the dedicated speakers who've come in to share their perspectives. And Victoria, I'll begin in you from the West. Good morning. How is diversity being recognized and accommodated in employment law in Nigeria? And how have you seen it play out in the workplaces there?
Hi, good morning, Kevin. Just confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Good. So in response to your question, so I would say that diversity is well recognized and accommodated in employment law and workplace policies in Nigeria. So the starting point for every conversation on diversity here would be the Nigerian 1999 Constitution as amended. The provisions of Section 42 sets the tone for diversity, as it provides the right to freedom from discrimination based on ethnicity, origin, religion, or political opinion. So the provision is like the foundation on which diversity for other pro-diversity laws that affect the workplace and consequential workplace policy would stand. Now, regarding the workplace, we have some specific workplace laws that promote diversity in the workplace. Now, the first law I would speak on is the HIV and AIDS Anti-Discrimination Act 2014. It prohibits the discrimination of persons based on their HIV and AIDS status. It prohibits the discrimination in the workplace of such persons, and it places an obligation on employers to adopt a HIV and AIDS workplace policy. This policy, seeks to just enforce the rights of these persons who live with HIV and AIDS. Now, another law that applies to the workplace is the Discrimination Against Persons with Disability Prohibition Act 2018. It prohibits the discrimination of persons with disabilities. And so regarding the workplace, what it does is that it provides for workplace protection for persons with disability by requiring that employers make reasonable accommodation for these employees with disability, including assessing the physical workplace and non-discriminatory recruitment practices. Specifically, it talks about employers having to build ramps, and if you have to access the workplace, these persons with disabilities should be able to access it. And I think the third law I would speak about is the National Mental Health Act of 2021. That it was enacted to protect and promote the rights of persons with intellectual disabilities, persons with mental health conditions. It has specific provisions for employers and states that a person with a mental health condition is entitled to equal access to employment opportunities, receive remunerations. It even goes further to state that employers are prohibited from terminating employment of these persons with disabilities solely on the basis of their mental health problems. So there's a positive obligation there that's while saying do not terminate the employment of these persons living with disability, it further states that employers should help these persons seek medical assistance. So given these laws, I can at least we can state that Nigeria indeed has these diversity. I recognize diversity in the workplace, and there's based on different aspects of our lives, gender, health, and all of that. So yes, we do have these laws and we recognize it in the workplace.
Thank you, Victoria. And I think your last 2 points really is a good segue for us with respect to persons with disabilities, and we recognize that the need to include them in the workplace. And I just want to go now to Daniel from Kenya and just understand, because Kenya just overhauled this persons with disabilities regime and introduced a new act of parliament for persons with disabilities. We just want to understand, Daniel, what are now the new inclusion obligations under the PWD's Act for employers, and when you speak about inclusivity and the Employment Act, and does it speak to the same as what Victoria is saying about there's a positive obligation for employers, and what should employers do?
Thank you very much, Kevin. Yes, Kenya's Persons with Disabilities Act 2025 represents a substantial upgrade in the legal obligations for inclusions of persons with disabilities. There was a previous act which had been enacted in 2003. However, the new act was enacted because to align it with the new Constitution 2010, and some of its major material obligations that have been placed on employers are that now employers with 20 or more employees are required to ensure that at least 5% of their workforce are persons with disabilities. Now, this is a mandatory requirement. It is also has provided for reasonable accommodation to be, to require the employer to make adjustments or modifications to the work environment, to the job duties, working hours, and technology, so that persons with disabilities can perform in their roles on an equal basis. The failure to do so will be taken as a form of discrimination under the new act. The new act also includes long-term physical, mental, intellectual development, or sensory impairments, including, for example, burnout, anxiety, as in the definition of what is disability. So the new act has broadened the definition of disability. It has provided for mandatory requirements, and it has also raised the retirement age for persons with disabilities above 5 years above the standard mandatory requirement age for public servants. For private employers, they are also encouraged to follow suit. It has provided for assistive allowances to persons with disability because it recognizes that persons with disabilities incur extra costs in transport or communication aids, and employers are therefore obligated to address some of these via the assistive allowance. The Act has provided incentives for employers to hire, persons with disabilities through tax deductions and incentives. If, for example, a person with disability is hired, there is a tax exemption of 25% of the salary or wage. And if the employer makes accommodations or invests in accessible technology and infrastructure, then there's a 50% tax exemption on the expenses.
Okay.
Employers now are also required to report annually to the National Council for Persons with Disabilities on how they're meeting the quota and inclusion obligations. This fits in with the Constitution of Kenya and gives life to Article 54 of the Constitution of Kenya, which specifically covers persons with disability and imposes an obligation on the state to ensure reasonable access to educational institutions, employment, and participation in society. It also is aligned with the Employment Act, which also describes or prohibits discrimination in employment on grounds of disability.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. And I think from your perspectives and Victoria's just concluded perspectives, we are seeing broadened protection. So there is a broader recognition of more what falls within the ambit of a person with disability, and then broader obligations. Daniel, you just mentioned reporting obligations for employers, the requirement to have at least 5% of your employees as persons with disability if you have more than 20 employees within your organization. And before we go to Imelda for the practical perspectives of this, I just want to shift to another group and perspectives from Jean now on how the legal protections that exist, especially in South Africa, for gender, culture, diversity, racial differences, and young employees, especially now that, even the World Economic Forum, the African Union is reporting that by 2030, young people will be the majority of workplaces in Africa.
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, I think you're very correct. So given South Africa's history in post-apartheid South Africa and post-1994, with the proclamation of the new constitution, there was an emphasis on, equality and prevention of unfair discrimination. And so right from the start, which is with the constitution, which is the apex legislation, you see the protections coming through with the Bill of Rights, which provides that there is protection against unfair discrimination on grounds such as race, gender, ethnic and social origin, age, disabilities, religion, etc. And then flowing from that, you then see that there is the movement, there is a specific legislation that's enacted, the Employment Equity Act, because it deals with, again, unfair discrimination and the prohibition of unfair discrimination certain grounds such as race, religion, age, disabilities, etc. And flowing from that, that's where you often see most of your claims emanating for, if there are to be claims, because that act is quite comprehensive. And it also places reporting obligations on employers to annually report to the Department of Employment and Labour in terms of certain obligations such as reporting on the employment equity barriers and plans to address that, etc. And that is and there's significant enforcement in that sector. So that's something that's followed up quite closely in South Africa. We also have things, the Code of Good Practice on the prevention and elimination of harassment in the workplace. And the reason why I raise this is because oftentimes harassment stems from differences. So you find people in the workplace might be excluded, or you find things like mobbing, etc. And so the legislature has recognized and has reacted by ensuring things such as the Code of Good Practice on the prevention and elimination of harassment in the workplace, which basically aims to eliminate all harassment in the workplace. There's also the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, which establishes equality courts within South Africa, which is all the high courts, and that's basically where victims can approach to get redress if they've been discriminated against on various grounds. And so there's quite comprehensive legislation in terms of protection against discrimination based on culture, diversity, and the like within South Africa, and it's quite rigorous. And the jurisprudence is also quite rigorous in that regard.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Jean. And now over to you, Imelda. The lawyers have spoken about the obligations for employers, what employers need to do, which obligations they need to meet, which reporting obligations they need to meet, which quotas they need to meet. From your Africa-wide lens, how do you see these from practical perspectives, and what have you seen human resources professionals or organizations do to meet these obligations?
So thank you, Kevin, and thank you, my learned friends, for all that you shared. So for me, from what I see, inclusion is basically once it's moved from paper to an actual employee experience, then you can see it's being implemented. What I've seen a lot of institutions taking up, and I'll just mention a few practical areas. One is, I'll begin with OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health. So you would note that quite a number of institutions have started nursing rooms for mothers. We have creche, and a number of institutions are now sensitive to things like neurodiversity, where there are people who are affected by things like, they're sensitive to light, they're sensitive to noise. So when an office is being set up, these are things that are taken into consideration. Do we have ramps? When you're buying something like a microwave, you make sure it has braille for the people who have some level of disability with their eyes. So these are areas that, from an OSHA perspective, that's really being looked into by quite a number of institutions. In some countries, we've seen that as part of what is mandatory, but in some countries where it's silent, employers are being forthright and just seeing how to support their staff, in as much as it's not in the law. It's just something that's a basic human right in some of the things. So I'm seeing quite a number of changes in some of the countries we operate in, even where the law is silent on some of these areas. So also introduction of the flexible working for people who have needs. For example, they need to go and pray. So you'd find they break off slightly earlier than the rest, and so on and so forth. When it comes to things like recruitment, how we send out job adverts has also improved over the years, I may say that. So accessibility of that, it's now not only on, say, LinkedIn, but when you decide to use the online platforms, for instance.
Hello, Imelda.
Sorry, you can hear me?
Yes, now we can. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we lost you at online platforms.
Oh, okay, sorry. So when it comes to online platforms, ensuring that the platform has support screen readers for people with visual impairments, ensuring that you're advertising just beyond that, right? You have job boards, we have communities where people post kind of adverts, ensuring that the language also used doesn't have a lot of jargon. And for instance, if you're saying you need somebody who speaks Somali, but all the adverts are in English, and where you're posting it is in Somalia, really, it doesn't speak to that. So we've seen a need to really customize to what we need. A good case in point is sometimes you go to places where you have conferences, and you have people speaking in the official languages, but most of the people speak the local dialect. So those are things to be sensitive to. And I've seen it being applied quite a bit when it comes to things like recruitment, just being sensitive around that. When it comes to the selection panel of the people who'll be sitting there, how diverse is that? So we look at age. You make sure that the panel also, has, people with different levels of experience, the tenure, gender, and so many other things that previously I think were not necessarily being considered. So that you don't have this homogeneous group deciding the fate of whoever is coming in. Just ensuring that that is balanced. When it comes to promotions, we're not just tied to a tenure only model. You look at other things. Are we looking at the skills the person is bringing on board? Are you looking at impact? Is there something innovative that somebody has brought on board? So all these things should inform how people are promoted and so on. And we are seeing it in the policies that are being put across and how that's being implemented. Largely, I think institutions by and large have been helped by the HR analytics, because we are now measuring all these different diversity, matrices. It becomes easier to know where there's a gap, because what is not being measured and tracked, it cannot be improved. So that has helped quite a bit in the HR space.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imelda, for those practical perspectives. And before I just let you go, there's another aspect to this conversation that we wanted to touch on as well, and that was inter and intra-generational dynamics and how that plays out within the workplace. As you would know, generally the African workplace is broken up to those who joined post-independence. Then there's the 80s and the 90s. Then now we have Gen Zs, and I think Gen Alpha is in the fold now, or they should be at the door.
They're coming soon.
They're coming soon. So how does that play out when you're managing teams and when you're speaking about those items of inclusion and how legal can support you?
Yeah, thank you so much. Indeed, I must say there's no one size fits all. One of the things that we found to be very critical is first making everyone aware that what motivates the different set of generations we have is very different. So in some institutions I've seen, they've come up with like a month where they celebrate a certain generation. Then you try and bring out what was there when they were growing up, what has influenced their way of thinking, and why do they think the way they think, and how do they work? How do they show up? So that has helped reduce a bit of tension, at least in some of the places I've worked, and I've seen it works very well. So you'd have like the 80s month, and the Gen Z month, those kind of things. So it has really helped a bit, because you'd find currently in the workplace, we do have baby boomers all the way to Gen Z. Baby boomers, they thrive on stability. They want hierarchy. They want, benefits like pension and home loans. But when you come and share the same with a different set of team, they're thinking, I really don't care so much for pension. When you're trying to get this person on board, you're not really buying, they wouldn't care for, they have zero loyalty. And they prefer, tell me about flexibility, how I could work. Tell me about my continuous learning. Tell me about my, what am I learning? What's the purpose of what I'm doing? So we find that the different groups have different set of needs and what they consider important. So even as we come up with this array of the compensation and benefits, what might look very good to one person, to the other person, they could sell it to the next person. They don't care. So what we've done is, when it comes to our policies and how we implement what we have, is try and be more inclusive. We're not throwing out one or the other, because there's no one that is better. I think it's all about what works for you. So we've introduced what we call like fast feedback loops, and I've seen a number of institutions that are also doing those kind of things, where instead of waiting till the end of the year to give feedback, how about giving feedback as soon as possible? So that works for different people, and we come up with ways of doing that. We have the formal structure of doing it, and then we have the informal structure. So it works for the different sets. When it comes to things like recognition, we do things like project-based learning. You do flexible work arrangement, so that you're able to take care of those different needs, across the different generations. Now, when it comes to legal, how they support HR from this aspect, mostly, if you ask me, it's from a policy perspective. Ensuring that if you have a flexible, like a flexi working policy, how airtight is it? Because I've seen scenarios where you would be sued because of what is in your policy, because it's so broad. When you say we shall provide vis-a-vis, a different word, then it looks like you had promised that you'll actually do this, but you actually don't have the resources to provide that. So the language used should also protect the employer. So those are the things that now we're being more intentional. Immediately after COVID, everyone just wanted a flexi working policy. So we're very quick to just do them very quickly, and we just created these things and unrealistic expectations. And soon thereafter, we had a scenario where it was impossible to control your crowd, because now the policy says we shall provide, we shall give you, and then you'll never see your employees forever. So just being sensitive to that, and legal have played a very critical role in just ensuring that while we're providing for this, we're not inadvertently creating discrimination, by ruling out a certain team or a set of people. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Imelda. And Daniel, in 1 minute, how do you see legal plugging in on this?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I echo what Imelda has said. In Kenya law, there are both constitutional and statutory provisions, concerning non-discriminations, and courts have made decisions on age in employment. Article 27 of the Constitution includes age among the grounds on which no person shall be discriminated against directly or indirectly. In the Employment Act, although the age is not explicitly listed among the prohibited grounds, courts have held that discrimination on age grounds may still be challenged. The Employment Act obliges employers to promote equal opportunity in employment and to strive to eliminate discrimination. The general duty of non-discrimination gives a legal basis to challenge any age bias, even if age is not explicitly spelled out in the Employment Act. The new Persons with Disabilities Act has increased the age of retirement for persons with disabilities to 5 more years than the statutory minimum for other public servants. Therefore, this is in recognition of their need. Other than that, there are cases where there have been advertisements for job opportunities which have an age that, like, above 35 years should not apply. This has been ruled by the courts in Kenya to be discriminatory. Therefore, it is important for employers to be sensitive about the law and to also, be sensitized about, treating teams which come from different generations, because they have different needs, and this will increase, morale and, innovation within the teams.
Welcome. Thank you, Daniel. And that closes the first topic of our discussion. And before we go to the second one, I just wanted to remind the audience, thank you for joining. You can post your questions on the Q&A function, and we'll take those as we go along. Now, we just want, and we've just discussed from a high-level perspective of what inclusion means, so what inclusion means in the law. We just now want to go deeper to see what does it mean actually in the African context within which we exist. And I want to begin with you, Victoria. Which cultural or systemic barriers do you see affecting inclusion, and not just any form of inclusion in leadership, because we could speak of inclusion all we want, but if that inclusion is not substantive, that has an impact as well, a negative one. So which barriers exist, and how do you see it play out in Nigeria or the West African?
So the first cultural barrier, that is very glaring here in Nigeria is the gender bias. And it just stems from like a deep-rooted cultural belief about women and, the stereotypical traditional roles that women are expected to, occupy here in this part of the world. And so even though Nigeria has several legislations that, prohibits the discrimination of persons based on their gender, Nigeria is a signatory to several international conventions that, still prohibit this discrimination. Gender bias is still a thing here, and, we see it play out in several instances. I had once attended an event where a speaker mentioned how male employees in her office would receive a housing allowance as part of their employment benefits, and then the female employees who doing the same job, same position, same job description, do not receive this housing allowance, because according to the employer, it's a man's job to pay for housing, and so there was no need to pay a woman the housing allowance. And so there are also cases of employers who would even refuse to hire women of childbearing age due to the assumptions about pregnancy and family responsibility. We recently even had the case before the court where the court had to strike down a provision of the Police Act for being discriminatory against unmarried police officers. So the particular section had said that for unmarried female police officers who got pregnant in the course of employment, they would be dismissed from employment. Now, this provision did not apply to male police officers who have maybe got females, pregnant. And so the court struck down that provision as being discriminatory against women female officers, and just held that was null and void against women. And so these limitations, we see them play out in the workplace, and it really affects women's participation in the workplace and their participation in top management roles. Yeah,
and thanks, Victoria, because you mentioned the the cultural barriers. And I just want to go to another major systemic barrier. And I know this is normally more treated against the government, and I'll be pinging this to Jean. Marginalized groups. How do we ensure marginalized groups are brought into the fold? I know it's easy to enforce against the government, to say the commission you've established does not have representation of marginalized groups, etc. But what about in the private sphere, for employers within the private space? How do we ensure we are also employing people from marginalized groups?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Kevin, simply because I think from the South African perspective, there's been such an emphasis on this with the Employment Equity Act, which puts an obligation on employers to recognize or to give special protections to what they call previously disadvantaged groups, which should be women, Black people, people with disabilities. And the term Black is kind of a catch-all. But in terms of this, there's also the obligation to then review the workforce demographics on an annual basis and to report on them, to say across our occupational levels, how are we doing in terms of these designated group or previously disadvantaged individuals? How many do we have in our workforce? And there's been recently an introduction of sectorial targets. So it's not quotas, it's targets. And it's basically employers are expected, as long as you have more than 50 employees, you're expected to work towards these targets over a period of time, 5-year period, and you report annually to the department on these. And of course, there's enforcement mechanisms and penalties and the like. But I think realistically, if we want inclusivity in our workplaces, the legal framework has to exist to force people to be inclusive. Because if we're left to our own devices, as employers, employers are busy, they're focused on profits, they're trying to run a business. It's unlikely that that's something that they might pay attention to, notwithstanding the benefits that come with having an inclusive workforce. It's only for an employer's benefit. I think inclusivity also looks like ensuring that there's representation in leadership amongst all the marginalized roles, because that can only enrich the decision making and the decisions that are coming out of the workplace.
Thank you, Jean. And now on back to Imelda from an organization perspective. And Jean has just mentioned how practically it may be difficult, at times to get to it. What are the and I'm missing the word for this, but the things that employers have to balance to just ensure that we are profitable, we are meeting all the KPIs, but also ensuring that within our leadership, we have the marginalized groups. We have all these groups which need to be included for a forward-looking workforce.
Thank you, Kevin. So how I see it is representation, it doesn't happen by chance. So there has to be a lot of intentionality around it to include the marginalized group in the leadership. And I look at it from a 3-tier perspective. The first one is around the pipelines. So in your pipeline, as an organization, you have to want to invest in leadership. development programs. So these are mentorships, these are sponsorships, these are stretch assignments, so that the people you're promoting to leadership can actually be able to do that work, so that you're not feeling that, oh, we just promoted you because of 1, 2, 3, but we have equipped you to be able to actually do that role and do it well. So that's the first one. When you're looking at still in the pipeline, how are you conducting your recruitments? Who are you partnering with? Reach out to diverse groups, be it university, disability networks, professional bodies, community groups, and so on. Places where I would consider outside your normal talent pool would be sourced from. That's where you're going to get those kind of people. And they're not the only places, but they will help expand your talent group to that extent. And then, like I said before, your analytics, you have to be intentional. We have a certain target that we want to achieve. Some countries are very clear on what that target would look like. You need to have so many people in leadership and so on. And if not, as an institution, what are those targets you've put for yourselves? How are you progressing on that? So you have to embed this in your practice. You need to have accountability mechanisms, say for the leadership, whereby part of their performance is on what is their progress on the inclusion targets for the specific groups that you want included, so that that can be measured and they are more intentional in ensuring that their teams are diverse and cover that. Also, in part of the practice, like I said, when you're reporting, the institutional performance, they should be part of what is being reported and how you're doing that. And then you normalize decision making by ensuring that these people are part of the decision making. Not saying we have marginalized people, but when you're making a decision, they're not part of it. And then thirdly, the other area that needs to be looked into by organizations to ensure that marginalized people are in leadership is in the processes that we have. What is the promotion criteria? You should focus on, like I said earlier, impact, the skills, the potential. So that if somebody has potential, you train them and then they can, take up the roles. Not just looking at are they a good culture fit, because you could have biases on those kind of things. And then how is your leadership done? It should be very transparent in terms of when you're recruiting for leadership or when you want to promote. The criteria should be transparent. You should be able to provide feedback so that if somebody did not meet the threshold the first time, they know what to do the next time. And also the panel of the leadership that exists should also be diverse. Because if it's homogeneous, chances are making it diverse also becomes very difficult. So it has to be, all these things have to work together for that to improve. Thank you.
Okay. Excellent. And thank you for those points. And I think because the question I was going to ask you, Imelda, was for organizations which do not have reporting obligations or which exist in countries which do not have reporting obligations, but you've spoken about how this should be inbred within the promotion policies, within the recruitment strategies, and also within the retention strategies of the firm. Now, I just want to turn briefly to Jean and Daniel. Because we've had the practical perspectives from Imelda from Victoria. We just want to understand now what legal can do, especially for organizations which exist outside the sphere of outside regulated environment. So you exist in a country which does not require you, for instance, to have a certain quota, or you exist in an industry which those quotas basically don't exist. How can legal teams within organizations or as external advisors advise? Beginning with Eugene, then Danielle, in 2 minutes each.
Yeah. I think I'll largely be echoing what Imelda has said, which is that you have to build in the policies within your organization. I think it firstly needs buy-in from the C-suite or from your executives, the management of the organization, to say, this is something that we want to, notwithstanding that we don't have an obligation to comply and we don't have any reporting obligations, this is something from a cultural perspective, from a values perspective, that we want to see it within our organization, and we recognize the benefit that it will provide. And so then you build in the policies in a realistic manner to regulate how we're going to do this over a period of time, because it won't happen overnight. And I think then it's more about making sure that you formulate policies that are sustainable, that are practical, and that are legally compliant.
Thanks, Jean. Danielle?
Thanks, Kevin. I agree with Jean and also Imelda. I think the future of work is inclusive, and therefore the employers should act now, because even the laws that are being, are in the pipeline, or the reforms that are coming, moving towards mandatory inclusion, not optional inclusion. What employers should do is review their workplace policies, check, review the law and whether the policies are compliant. They should also audit, their physical premises, whether they are accessible to persons with disabilities, whether they have assistive technology, because inclusion also includes digital inclusion, whether the apps that they are using are accessible to persons with disabilities, the recruitment processes, whether they're also accessible. They should also train, the leadership and also the staff, and sensitize them on diversity, and ensure that retirement policies are aligned. For example, in Kenya, the new Persons with Disabilities Act, there's need to review contracts because of the new retirement age. There's also need to put in reporting mechanisms or feedback mechanisms for inclusion, and I think this will ensure that the workplace is more inclusive going in the future.
Thank you, Daniel. And I think you both make a very good point that while it may be the case that there is no current obligation or no current legislation requiring you to do so, in 2 months' time, nobody is to say that the government will not require you to comply, and then you'll be scrambling to comply. And as we can all imagine, that will be at a greater cost than if already the organization was compliant. So that's just a point to note to all of us. Now, on to the last topic of our webinar, which is future-proofing the workplace. Yeah, now we are crossing over from just merging inclusion and how that looks in a technology advanced future for the environment, and some of the aspects which arose during COVID. And we just want to hear from Victoria, how have employment laws adapted to remote work in your jurisdiction? And I know remote people are now scaling back on remote working because the main trigger was COVID, and that's thank heavens going away now. But how was employment laws gone around that issue, even as we go to the next question?
Okay. So as you said, people are now really scaling back, but unfortunately, we do not have any legislation in Nigeria specifically tailored to regulate remote working. Despite its increasing prevalence in Nigeria, the law, the primary law we have on labor and employment, which is the Nigerian Labour Act, was drafted like several decades ago when it was, with conventional provisions, in-person employment relationships in mind. And so it didn't really contemplate that it would need to regulate modern work dynamics as we see now. And so what has happened in practice, and given the whole COVID-19 and remote working, is that our employment landscape has actually evolved, and many employers are now proactively or have proactively adapted to incorporating remote work provisions in employment contracts. They have developed internal work policies and established technological use guidelines. So you're seeing policies that would typically address an employer's expectations when an employee works remotely. You would see policies that cover data protection, occupational health and safety when someone works in a virtual environment. And so this has become it has increasingly become more. We've been seeing more and more of development in the data protection world, though, in response to remote working. So one other thing we are seeing, and I think is actually a global thing, is the growing trend of Nigerian professionals who work remotely for foreign employers. So we're seeing the increase in global freelancing platforms, remote work opportunities for these young Nigerians, because we have a really young group of people. Nigeria has like large, I think it's about 60% of its population. So there's a rise in cross-border gig work, and honestly, this has thrown up some legal questions around the applicability of the extant Nigerian labor laws that we have. We're beginning to or respond to questions around whether remote workers will be entitled to, the statutory employment protection under Nigerian labor laws, the tax implications that would arise, all of those things. So what I would say is that even though our laws are yet to catch up with the evolving world of remote working, the gap is being bridged by these structures where flexible contractual arrangements are put in place, internal policies, data protection frameworks are put in place. So we look forward to a legislative framework that captures remote working, but employers are already working beyond whatever legislative framework that we have.
Thanks, Victoria. And as you mentioned, the gig economy, I was just like, Jean will speak to us about the digital nomads in Cape Town. But before we get to Jean, Daniel, could you just highlight to us, and on the back of what Victoria has mentioned, for cross-border and remote hires, even for cross-border employers, what are some of the traps or some of the legal considerations that should be taken into perspective? And I think you'll be answering one of Victoria's questions. Will employment laws apply to them where they are based or where the employer is based, etc.? What are some of the traps in Kenya, Daniel?
Thank you, Kevin, for the question. It's a very current question, especially in a world of global teams and remote first hiring. First, the key legal frameworks involved in Kenya, for example, are the Data Protection Act, where even if the employer is abroad, the Data Protection Act applies. If you're handling data on Kenyans, you must register as a data controller or processor and meet the Kenya compliance rules. Then for cross-border data transfers as well, if personal data leaves Kenya, for example, to a payroll system hosted in another country, you will need, consent, proof that the destination country has adequate safeguards, a contract that ensures data protection is equivalent. If you are hiring from other countries, you also need to be aware that of the local employment laws there. For example, in Kenya, the Kenyan Employment Act will still apply. Kenya Data Protection Act also says that certain data must be stored in Kenya. At least one copy of that data must be kept on a Kenyan server or data center. So the common traps that often face employers is thinking that one size fits all. Your policy or the employment contract in your country may not meet Kenyan standards, and therefore it's important to localize and adapt, templates for each jurisdiction. Then the other trap would be the lack of consent. If when you are using their data, you should always use clear culture appropriate communication with the employees. The AI recruitment tools that don't account for example, disabilities, or don't account for human review are not, for example, applicable, and therefore you need to ensure that whatever you're using complies with the local laws. Then many remote, for example, workers in Kenya don't have stable internet or access to sophisticated devices. So if the technology being used by an organization requires high-speed connectivity or hardware, it likely lead to exclusion of certain people. Therefore, what's important is to audit all the tech you're using. You should also test the tools, whether they have bias, and therefore and also train the teams and HR on the need to understand the local data protection laws, the employment laws, the immigration, and also the tax laws of each local country.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And now to you, Jean. Cape Town is ranked among the top 10 cities for digital nomads and people who are doing remote work. What are the tax, immigration, and compliance issues that you see stemming from hiring talent across borders, and especially for remote workers, from both the employee perspective and the employer perspective?
Thanks. I think what Victoria and Daniel have raised are very key considerations. I think the firstly is that, the traditional boundaries of the workplace have dissolved, but the legal infrastructure is struggling to keep up. And so in cross-border work and remote working, you're seeing, I think, the three main areas that you always have to wrestle with as an employer is that there are tax implications, immigration implications, and labor law implications. And if you mess up on those ones, you might find yourself in a situation where you have your workers being misclassified, you might have double taxation, you might have run into troubles with the local labor legislation. So oftentimes, local labor protections will apply regardless of what governing law you specify in your contracts. And so you need to be very clear about how you're contracting with people across border. Because you might find that they're offered wider protections that then you're willing to offer, that you're offering to other local-based employees. From a tax perspective, there's two issues, or generally two issues that might come up, is that these tax laws don't operate in isolation. So where you might be resident, you might have tax obligations elsewhere, or having employees in a certain jurisdiction might trigger, as an employer, your tax obligations in that jurisdiction. And of course, immigration perspective, if the people are making sure that people have the right to work wherever they may be based, the digital nomads and the like. But I do think, without belaboring the point, I think some of the takeaways for employers, because this is becoming a prevalent issue, is that they need to be doing, firstly, they need to make sure that they have clear contractual terms in their employment agreements where they explicitly define what's the governing law provision, where's the work location, what the responsibilities are, what are the benefits, etc. And these contracts should be tailored to cover international assignments and remote work and the like. They need to be conducting regular legal audits, country-specific legal audits for labor law, for tax, and for immigration compliance. And that's, I guess, is where the HR comes in, because they have to then track what's happening, what are the thresholds for these three areas. Are we contributing to social security in that country if there's a requirement for that, etc. So HR would need to be on top of that. They also need to make sure that internally they have the right policies that deal with cross-border work, and specify how they as an organization will be dealing with it. And then of course educating internally the employees about what the protections are, what their social security rights are, visa restrictions, immigration, etc., to ensure that there's not any inadvertent breaches by these employees.
Welcome. Thank you, Imelda. Thank you, Jean. Sorry, I was just going to Imelda now. On the back of all the lawyers telling us about the obligations, what have you actually seen in the 14 countries, or close to 14 countries, that the Alliance for Green Revolution is present in? And now have you dealt with remote working or hiring across borders?
Thank you, Kevin. I think I'll build a bit on what Daniel and Jean have spoken about. So from a policy perspective, I would say even across all our countries, AI is not something that's actually been delved into deeply from a policy perspective in terms of how we're actually utilizing it and the dangers around it. Yes, we are seeing it showing up a bit from the data protection perspective, but that's just about it, right? And I think more perhaps could be done, especially in countries where that is not very clear in how AI comes in and so on and so forth. So AI has its benefits. I mean, we can't run away from it. From a HR perspective, it has made our work quite efficient in some things. However, the risk I see, and I think I've seen all across, is you cannot remove the human element. For instance, when it comes to making decisions, for example, we are hiring, we will not let AI do that final recruitment. It can help you with shortlisting, it can help you, with filtering and all those kind of things, but the human element is still very important. So that's something we've seen even with the advancement of AI, that cannot be replaced and should not be replaced, because then it can bring in biases. I say biases because any AI tool is basically dependent on the training data that's being fed into it. So if there are already existing biases in that data, the same will be replicated. So, for example, you're taking a tool to help you with the recruitment, and it's supposed to be shortlisted. So before you take up that tool, just check first if there are any set of biases. Maybe it's systematically removing people from a certain school or people at a certain level, and that information has has that information been fed to it, or where is it getting those biases from? So those are things that as HR professionals we need to look into, and also just being more intentional around the learning. I think Daniel spoke to that a bit for the HR professionals in terms of what do you need to know about that system? What kind of biases would it bring that you might be unconscious of? Because it's not something that necessarily we were very aware, but as the systems becoming more intelligent, it's critical that it's fed with correct data sets so that it doesn't give us biases that we're trying to run away from. And then in the African context, and I think this has come out quite a bit, the reality is things like the internet speed, say in Kenya, would not be the same as what you'd find in Mali or what you'd find in a different place. Also, context, not everyone has a smartphone. So whatever it is you're bringing in, make sure you're not unconsciously segmenting some people, from a socioeconomic perspective, unconsciously. So make sure whatever it is you're bringing in can be used by everyone, so that they can all be able to access the same, tool. So that's what I would say from my side.
Okay. And then the last question for you, Imelda, and you've touched heavily on artificial intelligence in the human resources process and the policies that follow. But we just want to also understand now, from even just stepping back before the era of artificial intelligence, how have you seen secondments and say secondments or just simply hiring a professional, say from Kenya to Uganda? What compliance hurdles have you faced? And is it almost the same as what Jean or Daniel was speaking about, from tax perspectives, immigration, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's what they have mentioned. By and large, most of it is tied around taxes, because the laws are different. But there's a sense of similarity for countries that I would say follow similar laws. For instance, I would say Mozambique has the most unique in all the countries we operate in, but you'd find the East African laws are similar, Nigeria and so on. Then West Africa, they follow sort of French laws. So you find, again, something that would look very normal in Burkina Faso is very strange when you go to Ghana, because you're like, why are you having all this? So you find they have allowances that don't apply on the other side. In some countries, you cannot you cannot employ somebody for a short period. You can't second somebody for a period beyond this. Or, so trying to get that to work has been a challenge. And also from a compensation perspective, that has to be looked into, because you're moving somebody from maybe their home base to a different place. Are they disadvantaged because of the currency and so on? So, those are some of the things that have made us, for example, we have, all salaries are benchmarked on, they are pegged on the dollar, just to remove that so that people are not feeling that if I am seconded to a different country, then I am disadvantaged based on the country that I've moved to.
Okay. Thank you very much, Imelda. And that was the last question. I just want now to close with final question to all the panelists, and it will be twofold. And we've spoken about, you just mentioned, Imelda, how in Burkina Faso you could be looking at something so materially different from what it is in Accra, Ghana. How can African countries collaborate to create more harmonized and inclusive employment frameworks in 30 seconds, beginning with Victoria?
Why do I think you're going to call me first? Okay, so how can African countries collaborate to create a more harmonized and inclusive employment framework? So I would say one way this can be achieved is, the creation of a unified regional labor standards, facilitated by the existing continental or regional bodies like the African Union or ECOWAS. And so, the approach I expect that they will take is similar to the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is, let me call it like one of Africa's ambitious what's the word now? I'm trying to think of the word now. It's an ambitious initiative, yeah. And so we're saying that the way AFTA has created a unified market for Africa, something similar can be created, and that promotes the free movement of labor across different African jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. Daniel, in 20 seconds.
Thank you. For me, I think we don't need identical laws. all we need is mutual recognition and common, minimum requirements. So the core standards should have, the same baseline for example, non-discrimination and minimum protections for, platform or remote workers. They should also be, I think, the issue to do with disputes. So there should be cross-border dispute pathways. So, for example, for to be accessible to employees who may probably work in jurisdictions that have different laws. So probably an arbitration, pathway for employment disputes.
Okay.
That is all. Yeah.
Victoria says a uniform framework. Daniel says a common baseline. What say you, Imelda?
I think I agree with both of them. I do. I think it's all about that, and just ensuring that, in those frameworks we are taking care of the local context, because I do appreciate we do have challenges with that.
Okay. Jean?
Yeah, I think, if you look at it holistically, most constitutions across the continent have those base protections that we're talking about. It's usually the issue is enforcement, monitoring enforcement. So I think we need a combination of what Victoria and Daniel have said. So we need a codification of our shared obligations and beliefs in terms of how you should be treating employees. But like Imelda has said, you need to cater for that for the local context, because we are such a vast and different culturally and all the things continent. We're not a monolith, and so that needs to be then the base recognition of what we want to aspire to, and then kind of a recognition of the local laws.
Welcome. Ladies, gentlemen, dear participants, we've come to the end of our webinar, but we wanted to open up the floor for Q&A from anyone in attendance. If you have any questions for the panelists, now is the time to raise those, either through the Q&A function or simply raising your hand. And I believe an allowance can be made to speak directly. Winnie has raised her hand saying, I don't know if you can allow Winnie to speak.
Winnie, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the session. And my question is for Daniel. You mentioned the expansion of the definition of disability under the changes to the Persons with Disabilities Act. And I wanted to find out, traditionally, it's been easier to assess who has a disability either by physical impairment you can see, but now with the expansion of the definition to maybe mental ailments or burnout, as you had mentioned, how do you think employers will go about assessing that?
Okay, thank you, Winnie, for your question. So for that, I think employers need to promote, a culture of, inclusion. Therefore, where you have, like we said, feedback mechanisms or ways for employees to open up and inform the employer in terms of their impairments. Well, sometimes when you invite voluntary self-identification, it may not work because of the stigma that goes around it. However, there should be an interactive process with potential hires and also the staff, where you're able to access what support is needed for each employer. So in the Act, it actually prohibits tests to prove disability or to probe severity. So that is not a method that can be used by the employer. So I think the first thing would be to focus on the skills that the employer has, and also to focus on adjusting the employment space to assist the employees perform their functions.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. And I just want to ping you to Imelda because I believe that question lends itself also to a practical approach. I don't know, Imelda, how you see it playing out.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Winnie and Daniel, for the response you've given, which is pretty much aligned to what I would have said. Because currently it's open for the employee to actually disclose that, so that relevant support can be rendered.
Thanks,
thank you. Thank you. I don't think there is another question, and we'd like to end, or there is from admin.
Good afternoon. My name is Lillian. I want to ask a question to Daniel. Daniel, you've said there's a determination that came from court on the issue of recruitment, that there's a certain age that is needed for a specific job. And now you cannot put the age as it's against the law, if I may be correct. I just want to understand from the employers or the HR and the house that does recruitment. Now, there's some jobs that are for specific age. It can't be for all ages. So how do you go about this one in advertisement so that you don't put yourself in contrary with the law, or you don't find yourself on the other side of the law?
All right, so thank you for your question. The Act actually provides for exemptions to discrimination in terms of it if that particular there's an inherent requirement for a certain level of experience. So I think the law, the employer can argue that it is an inherent requirement for that particular role. So that is the only way that the law can recognize that a certain level of experience is needed for a certain role. But however, the specifying the ages is discriminatory if it is not an inherent requirement of that particular role.
Welcome. Thank you, Daniel. Imelda, your perspective had been requested as well on this point.
Yeah, I think I agree with Daniel on that, because we have actually removed age as part of the requirements we usually ask for, unless it's specific to that role. And I think the only roles that I have seen where we include that, because it's in the policy, is when it comes to safeguarding, and we are looking for, say, youth below 35. That's when we could mention it. Otherwise, for the rest, they've been removed, and across all the countries, even the ones that don't have that requirement. Yeah.
Thank you. Gerald?
Can you hear me?
Yes, clear.
So thank you so much for this conversation. So mine was on the inclusion part, and I think I liked the words that that Victoria used when it comes to, like, there might be cultural barriers, right? So in terms of, so let's say in society like Kenya, where, let's say, people of the LGBTQ community are, you can discriminate because ideally it's not mentioned in our laws. So how do we find ourselves in a situation, or sometimes now we have also religious bias? So what will be your idea of how do we make workplaces such inclusive? Do we need to force employers to accommodate such individuals, or how do we foresee a situation whereby we are not, obviously we know that these barriers within organizations, and maybe let me add context to it. Within organizations, I think you talked about the various age groups. So you might find a diverse workforce whereby people in their 60s and 70s, if that's allowed in certain countries, are, they grew up in a different world where these inclusions weren't there, vis-a-vis let's say the Gen Zs of the world right now are more inclusive. I'm generalizing here as well. So how do we find a where do we find a middle ground? Do we force employers to include these individuals, or do we wait for policy change, as I think Emelda had said before? Do we wait for the law to push organizations to foster such inclusive opportunities? And also within the workplaces, how do you ensure to make your employees more tolerable to these differences? Because I believe that's also something that we've not talked about, is that externally it might be, accept everyone, but internally, how do we make our employees more acceptable to these different groups, diverse views of individuals who are coming into the workplace? Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. Victoria?
Okay, so Gerald, I hear you, and the different things we've talked about today, what has struck me is the fact that everybody seems to have, every jurisdiction has what do you call it, legislations around discrimination and anti-discrimination practices. But one key thing is, other than these discriminatory practices, other than these legislations, how are these things being enforced? So the way this can be enforced in the workplace, from my standpoint here, is that HR, legal should be very intentional about fostering this inclusive workplace. And because of the different leadership styles for different groups, one has to take into cognizance what applies to the older generation, what applies to the younger generation. Now, I would recommend things like a cross-cultural awareness training, open dialogue. You would really play a critical role here in helping teams navigate the nuances that would probably rise in having to have the older generation on one hand and the younger generation on one hand. Things like that, intergenerational mentorship. Yeah, I think that will work there, where even though these persons are seen as older, different skill set or different way of handling things, this is something the younger generation can learn from those people. So other than having the laws, let us also enforce or implement these things in the workplace. You're muted, Kevin.
James, sorry. Yes, I believe that brings us to the end of our webinar this morning. We want to thank all the panelists. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Imelda. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Daniel, for making the time. To our attendees, thank you very much. Just to note that this is not legal advice, and should you have any specific need for legal advice, please reach us or reach any of the panelists today for specific legal advice tailored to your circumstances. We want to thank you all. Until the very next time, my name is Kevin, and I've been your moderator. Bye-bye.